Welcome to LYLAS. I always say if you grew up in the 90s and you know what that stands for, then this podcast is for you. But this podcast is for anyone who's working on becoming the best version of themselves and improving their mental health. So, guys, gals, it's all for you.
Yeah, seriously. Anybody that's got a head on their shoulders, right?
Right.
Thoughts just going through their head. Now, I appreciate this topic because, you know, flipping switches. Last episode, we kind of talked from me being taking more of like a health psych kind of route. And now we're talking much more about the clinical psych route, I guess, in some ways. But honestly, this is just our thoughts and how toxic, trapping, blocking they can totally be. And that's not indicative of, let's say, a diagnosis, so to speak. It's just the way that our mind functions. It will always try to create things because it's an imaginative kind of organ or component. And here we go with it. So we're really going to take some fun and hopefully helpful deep dives into this whole thinking thing.
Yeah, you always hear people say these days, like, get out of your own damn way. You know, if you're trying to do something, if you're trying to accomplish it, a lot of times we get in our own way. And so today we're going to talk about how do you get out of, what does that mean exactly? And then how do you get out of your own way? This one resonates for me because I always identified with cognitive behavioral therapy. CBT was always, whenever we studied it in school, it just aligned with a lot of my thinking. And I remember at some point in college, like having this epiphany, like, aha, like you control your thoughts, you control your behavior, you know? And like I had figured it out. I had figured out the key to life. And I was thinking the other day, I'm like, what happened? Did I forget the key? Did I forget how to use the key? Like, what went wrong here? Because not everything works out the way that you thought it would. And so this was a good refresher. And so I've really started to use some of these things, these techniques we're going to talk about today, but started to use these again for myself in identifying negative thought patterns to get out of my own damn way.
Yeah, and that's really what it comes down to because so often, I just feel like that we think that we have these thoughts and that they're facts. And then we
Mm-hmm.
start to live our life based on them, or that we don't even know where they come from. And it might just start off as like one like cart or box on the train, and then all of a sudden we have a full freight train
Steam locomotive coming at you.
packed, running through our head constantly. And we don't know how we got there. We don't know where it started. All we know is that we have all of these thoughts running through our heads all the time, and that we just often feel so out of control with it and don't even know again where it kind of started or where it's going to go from there. So
Well, and we really believe those thoughts. And I think that is something to really ponder, is that we can not only generate these ideas, but then convince ourselves to believe them as truth. Like they must be true, or I wouldn't be thinking these thoughts over and over again. And just how your mind really can play tricks on you. If you're not careful, you can get in these loops and it can be very difficult to get out of them.
yeah, there are these, you kind of coined it really well, like the Ferris wheel of hell kind of a thing.
Yeah.
I call it going down like the rabbit holes.
Yeah.
It's whatever term kind of fits for us, but it always leads to a trap. It always almost leads to us feeling stuck and overwhelmed, depressed, anxious. A whole lot of those more negatively based words is generally where this whole thing just kind of sends us down into that path. So for sure, for
So,
sure.
yeah, let's talk about some of these traps that we get ourselves into
Yeah.
and how easy it is to slip right into one.
Yeah. And, I guess to start off, I want to, bring, I'm very language sensitive, you guys know. And so I try to avoid using words that are emotionally heavy or laden. But the big hopeful takeaway from this is that if we can identify what these negative thinking patterns are, and maybe even work with a professional, maybe just kind of have our own self-awareness techniques and challenging techniques, reframing, some of these things that we're going to talk about, the trap goes away. You're not trapped forever. This is not like, you've been locked in a prison cell, thrown away the key, and now dropped in the middle of the ocean and are sinking. It is absolutely possible to work through this stuff. And I just want that to kind of be the hope that kind of comes from it. But it really does start, I think, with just identifying these unhelpful or ineffective, unhealthy thinking patterns. And so, I know we have some professionals that listen to this, and we have a lot of folks that are just kind of, trying to figure things out, just what we talk about. And so if you go down this big Google search, you can look up cognitive distortions, you can look up unhealthy thinking patterns, whatever. It's the same word for the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
It really doesn't matter that much. So don't get stuck on that. What we want to kind of focus on is what types of unhealthy thoughts plague us specifically, and it may not be the same for everybody, and that's just fine. And we may have some that are worst enemy, best friend that we go to very often. So with that being said, just to name a few of them, like that all or nothing thinking.
Mm-hmm.
If you find yourself in one of those places where it's just that black or white, like it's either this or it's that, then that right there is its own trap.
I think a good example of that one for me is when I think about working out. I like to keep data on like what workouts I'm doing, and I get very easily in that trap of like, oh, I didn't work out 3 days in a row or whatever it is, or I didn't run 3 days in a row, whatever it at the time. And then I started doing this training program called E2M. And one of the trainers on there always says it's not all or nothing, it's all or something. Like, did you do something today to move your body? Like that's really your only goal. And I love that phrase of it's just all or something.
Mhm.
You don't have to run 5 days a week. You don't have to weight train 3 days a week. Did you do something for your body? And you could apply that to anything, but that's just a really concrete example that I feel like resonates with me.
Absolutely. And it does apply to just about anything. So if you're working a to-do list and you didn't get it all done and you're like, oh my
Right.
gosh, I didn't get this thing done, I failed for the day. All or nothing thinking usually has an adjoining emotion of failure
Mm-hmm.
associated with it. And so if we kind of again think about like how our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors are all connected, like I did in one of those videos, then most of these thoughts will then have, again, it's negative emotion best friend that just wants to, come along and play with it too. And
Yeah.
so all or nothing thinking, if you then have that feeling of failure associated with it, then bing, 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 bing. That's
Mm-hmm.
probably one of the traps that you yourself might be falling into. And
Yeah.
so, as we talk about these things, we'll throw out some little tips and stuff like that. And then at the end, we'll kind of go through just some global ways that we can reframe. And again, kind of veer off of these, but it's just real important that if you're taking notes on this or if you use our resource page, the more effective you can be at identifying what your trap is, the healthier that we can work through some of this stuff. Mental filter. Everybody has a filter. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Jen and I, you've heard us talk. We both wear contacts. Um, but think of the world that you look through with that type of lens.
Mm-hmm.
And, I actually took mine out for the first time in a long time this weekend. Such a bad contact user. But that's because my lens that I was looking through was becoming foggy. It wasn't crisp, it wasn't clear. The images that I was literally seeing with my eyes were not reflective of the world and what was
Mm-hmm.
going on. And that is the same thing that a negative mental filter does for
Yeah.
ourselves. So we are not looking at the things that are happening within our life, within our relationships, within a fair kind of balanced perspective. They always have this taint to them.
Kind of
And
like half glass full, half glass empty. Like you're either one or the other, generally speaking.
yeah, yeah. Or it even sometimes comes to um, looking at things with even a negative anticipation happening to it. Like
Mm-hmm.
it's almost, as we'll talk about, almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy in some ways. Well,
Mm-hmm.
I know that this isn't going to go right. And already having that brush stroke on the canvas then kind of again taints the picture. Because as human beings in general, we don't like to be wrong, right?
Right.
And so even if that event turns out, or whatever activity I'm thinking about turns out to be like the best thing ever, because I've already painted the nasty color on that canvas, I don't want to be wrong in saying that it was going to be shit.
Hmm.
So even my opinions then coming out of it are not going to be truly reflective of the experience, because I'm seeing things through that filter, and then I want to be right, supposedly, in what my filter's perception of the world kind of is. So
Well, and
it,
it's going to impact the person you show up as for that event, or whatever it is you're kind of already viewing in a negative light. It's going to change the way that you show up, the way that you approach the situation. So it's already having that negative impact on your behavior. Even before you get to the event, it's already impacted you.
yeah, you're not walking in it with your best shoes on, right?
No.
No, that's so true. And, you know, if we think about like another aspect of this that I think, you know, again, this is a general kind of topic, but that really, really relates to women, and kind of back to episode 4 when we talked about imposter syndrome, it's that
Mm-hmm.
even with our successes, we are not seeing our successes as necessarily being ours whenever we're using a negative filter with it. You know what I mean? We're attributing it to other things instead of just us at being really good at something. You know, we're going to again put it to something else. And what we also tend to do is notice our failures a
Mm-hmm.
whole lot more. And I mean, it's like we nurture our failures, right? Or our perceived failures. And we want those things to grow. And that's not right. I mean, that
Well,
doesn't work.
you called me out on that exact thing this week or last week when I called you. I started that part time position, and I called Sarah afterwards and I was like, I've really got to up my game. This is like a real strong school team. And these parents, it's a completely different socioeconomic status that I'm dealing with. It's a completely different setup from what I'm used to. And so when I called to tell you this, you said, "Oh, hey, imposter syndrome." Like, we had just done a podcast on that exact issue. And she was like, "Look at what you're saying to yourself, that you're not capable of this." She's like, "You've been doing this for 15 years. You know how to do this job. You're more than qualified." And she's right. I had to really like kind of talk myself down of you are qualified for this. You are good at this role. And there's a reason why someone reached out to me to cover for them. There's lots of other people that I'm sure, could have reached out to, but for whatever reason, they picked me. And so I had to really have those conversations with myself and not discount. I'm so quick to discount myself because I am silly and like to make jokes. But yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, you have to be willing to give yourself credit where credit's due. And that's really hard, I think, for women in general.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know. I don't know if that's one of those curses that we were, you know, kind of biologically blessed with, so to speak, or not, but it's a very common place for us to kind of, a very common trap for us to find ourselves in, for
Yeah.
sure. Society doesn't help. Many things don't help. But at the end of the day, it's ourselves that are probably not helping out the most here. Right.
Right.
So, but no, it is important. So I would just, you know, pay attention to what filter that you're looking through. And the best one is a clear one, you know, that
Mm-hmm.
does not have judgment, that does not have paint on it. You know, again, if you wear glasses or contacts, you don't want to look through something that's foggy, fuzzy, or, you know, distorted. You want
Well,
to
and
see.
I think you want it to be rooted in truth,
Mhm.
and not just maybe what you think someone's perception is or might be, but what's the truth of the matter, and really sticking to the facts and replaying those in your head versus what
Mhm.
you're afraid of necessarily.
Yes, absolutely. And spoiler alert, I mean, this is actually, we're going to talk about the other famous cognitive distortions or unhealthy thinking patterns. But at the end of the day, if any human has figured out a way to make their thoughts actually come true, like, oh, like you just done something remarkable, because I can think all day that I'm going to, you know, I'm a big purple elephant. And at the end of the day, homegirl is not going to turn into a big purple elephant. So the day that somebody is able to make that happen, then all that we can throw this away and everything else is fine. But our thoughts are not facts.
You don't think you could manifest being a big purple elephant?
I know. You know, that's where it goes to feelings too. Like I can totally feel all day like I'm a big purple elephant, especially if I've just like, not been mindful and gorged myself on something. And you know what? At the end of the day, still, even though I think I'm one and I feel like one, I've never woke up to be a big purple elephant. It hasn't happened yet. So
Keep manifesting. It could
I
be in your
know, right? Right. I guess so. That's what we tend to do with these things. It's much easier, I guess, huh? But all right, moving with this stuff too. So jumping to conclusions is another real popular one. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and that just comes down to us again, maybe having this layering effect with our thought processes in which we're already thinking something negative is going to happen. And we're going to go ahead and jump to a conclusion and act like it did. Many of us tend to, have that mind reader kind of thought process where we can imagine something, particularly what other people are thinking, and have no.
Which is just wild. If it sounds so ridiculous when you say it out loud, but it's so true. How often do we immediately just assume somebody else's perception of something? And we all, I mean, I think that's what's really interesting is that we all have our own perception of everything that happens, every incident, every person, our own perception is going to be formulated, but it can be very different. The same exact activity or experience can be perceived by different people in completely different ways. And when you jump to those conclusions of what you think someone else is thinking, it just sets you up for so many issues there, for anxiety, for disappointment. I think a lot of times when we assume, we get disappointed at the same time.
Yeah, it's just that whole mind reading thing is just one thing. Just again, if we're thinking we know what another person is thinking, and again, you truly believe this, then start playing the lottery. Like, let's put these skills to
Yeah.
something.
let's
You know what I
let's
mean?
test it and see.
Kind of
I mean, how
effective.
many of us do that with our spouses? I
Oh,
mean,
God.
I'm 100% guilty of that in my relationship, of just assuming that I know exactly what he's thinking. And I would say majority of the time I'm way off.
Right.
Um, especially if it's something contentious. I'm almost certain to be wrong, but it's true that we do this as a practice and we've gotten really good at it. We've practiced this over and over now for 40 years, and now we're really good at these sort of cognitive distortions.
Yeah, 100%. And future telling is another one too. And we kind of talked about that a little bit with the mental filter. And again, you can kind of see how these things are like a lot connected. But that's like just predicting the future. Again, you
Mm-hmm.
know that something bad's going to happen. If you really believe that that is true within your own life, then I would challenge you to do two things. One, be reflective of your effort meter. Okay, so we all have these little meters within inside of us that, and I'm not talking like for real. I speak in a lot of analogies, so let's just go with me on this one, right? Um, Whenever we already think that something is not going to go well, our effort meter is going to shrink in
Mm-hmm.
terms of what we're going to do to maybe make that outcome be different, because we've already made a prediction about it being bad or sucking or whatever word that we want to put into it. And if I already think that way, I'm not going to do anything likely, right, to change that outcome, because what's the point?
No.
So, first off, I would challenge you to really look at your effort meter and see if you were putting as much effort into the event as if you thought that it would go well.
Right.
Because I'm pretty sure if we're really being honest with ourselves, the answer is no. And then on the other side of this, if you are really this great at predicting the future, and I know I'm being somewhat facetious, but as a clinical practitioner, I tell my patients I'm not nice. I'm not the one that you go to for hugs and cuddles. Like, I'm the one that you come to if you want to get your shit together, right? Because this is what we're here for, folks. Um,
Uh,
I know, right? But then with this whole negative prediction and future telling, there are tons of world disasters that if you're this good at like predicting the future, then let's help a brother out here, you know?
Yeah.
And I know, again, I'm kind of almost exaggerating and being facetious about this, but in seeing how awful these places can be and how impactful they can be on someone's life, it's really the same thing
Mm-hmm.
in terms of the disaster that it can create within yourself. And so,
Yeah,
yeah,
absolutely.
yeah,
I think a lot of us, I don't know, I hope a lot of people can relate with. I laughed because I'm so guilty of that, like catastrophizing something, or particularly like with my husband and my kids. If he's doing something I have deemed unsafe with the children, which trust me, it's not, it's just I've now catastrophized what could happen and
mhm,
decided that it will in fact happen. And he is always just like looking at me like I have lobsters coming out of my ears because he's like, it's not going to happen. Like, chill out. But you can really work yourself up
mhm.
pretty quickly when you start thinking about worst case scenario.
Oh,
And
instantly.
that's something I have to really work at. I have to like catch myself in the thought and have like a moment where I say, okay, how is this serving me? This is just going to cause me to get worked up, probably going to end in an argument with someone. And all for what? Because of something I'm afraid of, something that could potentially, maybe, some way, somehow happen.
Yeah.
But I think that also goes back to when we talked about just saving your worries for real worries. Like those are going to come, and saving those for when you actually need to worry or when you're going to worry about something that's really worrisome, if that
No,
makes sense.
no, that's exactly right. And you actually just beautifully illustrated two things. Like, and again, catastrophizing is its own unhealthy thought, but then you paired it with like predicting,
Yeah, right.
and it just speeded up the train. That's
Oh,
exactly what we're talking about. Yeah.
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 So it's not that these things are um, almost like separate and exclusive. Like if you have one, you're not going to have another. No, man, these things want to like pile on you.
All intertwined.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. Emotional reasoning, that's another big popular one that we think about because again, if we think we feel a certain way, then that must be true.
Mm-hmm.
And we often don't look at the behaviors that are associated with the facts.
Right.
Instead, we just focus on the feelings of it. And again, that's where so much of this negative spiral just kind of gets just set in. So, I mean,
We've all
emotional,
been there.
huh?
I mean, I can relate to literally every single one that we talk about. I'm like, I have a very definitive example of every single one. Some of them I have gotten much better. Like, this is one I would say when I was in my early 20s, I really struggled with that. I could really make up things in my head and, just like the train just running right off the tracks. But now, as I've gotten older, I've gotten better with that, I would say, but it's still, I mean, I think about them. I'm like, I can honestly identify with each and every one of these.
Oh, yeah. And I think we all can. And that's why it's so important to talk about because the more that we identify, the more that we call it out, honestly, the less likely we are to continue to believe it. It's kind of like looking underneath of the bed and seeing that a monster's not there. We really
Mhm.
feel that there's something very scary and deep and dark. And it's just going to take a lot of practice and time for us to realize that that's not there. That the more that we call something out, the less likely it is to scare us in a big sense.
It's like chipping away at 40 years of practice, practicing these negative scripts in our head. But that's the only way to do it is to really just start and say, be very aware of the thoughts you're thinking and what's that like physical impact that it's having on you as a result.
Gosh, that could be again, I could switch gears real quick and go down into that whole physical aspect of all of this stuff. Because again, what you think and your emotions dictate so much of your health-based behaviors and the way in which your body physiologically functions. Because if you think it, our body does not have a mechanism to determine if it's not real.
Right.
Our body's job is to respond truthfully to what's happening. Period.
Yeah.
It does not know that if our thoughts are so strong and so it responds the same exact way. And that's why stress is one of the number one predictors of heart disease or of strokes or of other poor medical outcomes that could be happening. All of that comes down to, again, this interconnectedness between these things. And so, you know, just throwing it out there.
Right. We already have so much stress in our lives. Why do we add more? Like, from ourselves. There's plenty of stress that already exists. That the one thing we should be able to control is what we're bringing to it,
Oh,
the
yeah.
thoughts in our mind. And that goes back to like getting out of your own way. So many of us are just like, think of what you could accomplish if you could get out of your own way.
Yeah. And that I think is a moment of pause. Like you
Yeah.
even saying that, and then everybody just like taking a minute, taking a deep breath and being reflective. What am I doing right now that I am actually the barrier, that I am actually getting in my own way with these things? And again, that is how you get out of the trap. Now, we may think that we are tied and that we are in a bear claw trap and then we have a cage over top of us. I mean, we might be living in a pretty good trap. But every time that you bring awareness to one of these things, it's like breaking free.
Yeah. And I mean, it could be so many things that could be in your way. I mean, if you were struggling with addiction, if you're struggling with grief, like there's many other things that could be in your way of sort of elevating at this time. But if you're recognizing that you're primarily the reason, or some of your behaviors are what's getting in your way, those are tough conversations to have with yourself. Grief is not necessarily something that you can abstain from, even if you want to. You can't if it's for good reason, but like other just habits, so many of our habits, as we've talked about, really it comes down to, how does this serve me? Is this really helping me get to where I want to go?
Yeah, yeah, totally. And again, just, bringing yourself to that kind of point of awareness, that honest self-questioning without self-judgment,
Yeah.
really, again, be what opens the doors to so much of our life again. Um, and it just kind of, even thinking about a few of these other things real quickly, I'm real good at a mind that I have to be aware of is almost emotionally labeling something, because
Mm-hmm.
there is no purpose in putting an adjective before an action. So
Like, give
Jen,
us an example of what you mean by that.
right, right. So Jen edits everything that I write, because remember, back to the like, kind of being a squirrel too. But I do know grammar, kind of for the most part, to a degree. But what we're talking about with an adjective is that I don't want to put like something that describes in front of what I'm getting ready to do. So it's like, that's going to be too hard. I hate doing this. I
I
hate.
hate running,
Yes.
or something like that.
Yes. Anytime that you put any type of descriptor in front of an action, it's going to limit you in wanting to do it. And again, then it's maybe going to set off a whole bunch of those other unhealthy thinking styles on top of it, which is just going to, throw you in the trash all over again. And so really paying attention to emotional labels as it applies to tasks, and then even as it applies to yourself on things. So like, I'm a loser, you know what I mean? Whenever you take that and then that also becomes your identity, is a part of an emotional label with things, or to even other people. Um, it's a very cautious word. We have a S word in our house that our kids aren't allowed to say. And it's a common one. You hear it everywhere, but it's just one that has so much negativity that I don't even want to say it now. And it's
Stupid.
not
Is
even
that
like,
what I'm thinking of?
huh?
Is it stupid?
It is.
Yeah. I think I've
Yeah.
heard you say that before, that you really hate that word.
No, we do not use that word within our house. Like, it is not a word that we use in regard to anything. Into another human, into an animal, into a rock. It's just, but it's awareness again to those emotional labels and how much that they can affect self-esteem, how much they can affect um, what you choose to do with your
Self-worth.
life, everything. Yes.
Yeah. I think good and bad. I think, for so long, I identified as a school psychologist. Like, that was my identity. to a great extent. And so when I stopped practicing, it was like, well, what is my worth? I mean, if I go back and read my journal, like I'm literally writing these sentences to myself, like I feel worthless because I'd attached so much of my self worth to what I did. That wasn't who I was, that was my job.
Mhm.
And I had to kind of separate myself at some point and be like, that's just what I did. I'm so much more than a school psychologist. I'm more than a mom. I'm more than a wife. I'm more than there's layers upon layers to me. And then I'm a surprise on the inside now.
I love it. That's fun.
But the truth of the matter is, like, just any kind of label that we attach to ourselves automatically puts us in, like you said, it puts you in a box. And it was like, well, that's what she is. Well, that's part of who she is, but that's not her in her entirety. So just kind of removing all labels, good, bad, all the labels, and just, there's things you like to do. You have hobbies, and just really starting to express ourselves outside of labels.
Mhm. Labels aren't generally good. I know that they're required to be on like food and stuff like that right now, but if you pick up an apple from a grocery store, a real raw apple, it's not going to have a label on it. Why? Because we know it's a real thing.
Mm-hmm.
Labels are
Mm,
they're just not, they're, they're not generally good.
yeah.
If you're consuming something that has a label, or if you are consuming thoughts and emotions that carry labels, it's probably, also not great.
Yeah.
So,
If you're consuming something that has to tell you what it is,
mm-mm,
yeah,
mm-mm. Just
generally speaking, just
right,
something to ponder.
right, just there. We're gonna leave that one there. And just, for the sake of just kind of time and getting through some of this stuff too, you know, a lot of us use overgeneralization. And basically, if you use words like everything, always, never, nothing, then bing, 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 bing. This is you too. If you use words that carry absolutes, or if
Mm-hmm.
you use them in arguments, you never pick up your clothes. Homegirl, you just lost that argument,
Mm-hmm.
because there's been one time in that human's history in which they did do that.
Right.
Don't set you up. Don't set yourself up in that regard either. But they're not helpful, and they're not accurate. And so
Yeah.
again, we want to try to focus on things that are accurate. Um, Discounting the positives, as we kind of talked about, that's one of the most common things. I think, again, not to be exclusive, but chicks, we're really good at that. We are really, really, really good at sending our success to other avenues instead of allowing it to sit in with ourselves.
Yeah.
And so, again, mindfulness to that is important. Magnification, minimization, and then, as Jen kind of mentioned, the catastrophizing. We tend to magnify the difficulties of situations. We tend to minimize our ability to cope with difficulties, like that we just don't have what's needed in order to do whatever that might be. But then we also apply it to others and say, oh, it's just so easy for them,
Mm-hmm.
or they don't have any problems. And so then we're falling down into like two cognitive traps. And then, before we know it, we're swirling in the toilet bowl again.
Right.
Yeah, yeah. So again, just being aware if we're falling in that. And those really are those kind of like, again, negative places to go that don't carry a lot of fairness to them. And that's where we want to kind of sit with things. If you notice that you use words like should or must, there is this great and slightly, inappropriate line that one of the famous psychologists of history used to say: you should not should on yourself or masturbate, is what he would say. And so you can kind of read in between the lines on that one. But anytime that you apply the word should to your life, it means that you basically had everything that you needed to do, the knowledge, skills, and ability to do something different, and you actively chose not to. And I don't know that that exists.
Yeah.
And so it's an unfair self-judgment in so many ways. Or to say that you must, that again, you're throwing yourself into a loop with that.
Or
And
that all or nothing thinking of it must be this way. There's no other acceptable alternative.
Mhm.
I'd say I'm pretty sensitive to the extremes, like saying never or always doing something. I've always been very mindful of that with my kids, particularly, and maybe it's from the millions of rating scales I've written up over the years. Where if you've ever had to fill one of those out, or if you're a teacher and you've ever completed one, you know, a lot of times it's asking you to rate like a child's behavior on a scale of like never, sometimes, often, or almost always. And I would often say to people as they were going to fill these out for me, think of the child on an average day. Don't consider their best or their worst, because we're very rarely an all or never types of behaviors or situations. And so I've always, that's stuck with me over the years. And with my kids, I just said I always do this, which I clearly don't, but I am very mindful about saying things. If they're like, we never get to do this, I'm like, well, actually, that's
Mhm.
not true. And just how we don't talk in extremes. And we've actually had that conversation about not talking in extremes or blaming each other in extremes for things, especially with kids. When they argue, they always want to say, I never get to do this, or she always does this, or he's never nice to me. And so we have that conversation now, and their little minds can understand that. I can see the way that they rephrase things whenever they are trying, you know, when they're frustrated. Um, so I think it's, you know, trying to just model these reframes for our kids too, because clearly it's something that we're still struggling with at the ripe age of 40. And saying these things out loud of like, oh, that's a, you know, I'm in, it's a negative thought and that's not true. And here's what I know to be true. And just teaching them from a young age how to kind of rephrase the
Yeah.
thoughts in their head.
Well, and you're bringing up a really great point too, and that's so much or so often what we think we say.
Mm-hmm.
And even if we're saying it in reflection of ourselves, our children are still hearing that.
Mm-hmm.
And guess what? They then start saying that in reflection of themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Their home environment is their very first learning environment. Sorry, school psych. I just took that one from you.
No, say it louder for the people in the back.
Right.
Schools can't
Right.
teach everything. It starts at home.
It does. And, you know, I don't mean to say that to put more responsibility on the parents, but it's also to be reflective of the facts.
Right.
And what you think about yourself, you often say out loud, even with unawareness or unintention, all of those things. And then the people around you hear it, they say it, and then probably worse, they start to internalize it for themselves or they start to personalize it. Like, even if you're a person that, and kids say this, it's all your fault, it's all your fault, or it's all my fault. Sweetheart, they heard that from somewhere.
Right.
Be aware of where these things, you know, where we're at with them and then how they manifest in other areas of life. And, you know, just to go through like a few behavior traps, because, you know, I mean, that's its own rabbit hole. If you find that you are a procrastinator,
Hmm. Ding,
that's
ding,
not,
ding.
that often doesn't lead you down a healthy path, because then it just creates so much anxiety there at the end.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I don't need to say this again to people, but you just, you know, if you are one, many people who are procrastinators self-identify, you know,
Mm-hmm.
and then continue to do it because there is some level of reinforcement at the end a lot of times. You know that you can get through it if you have to. I just don't know that that's the healthiest way to go about it. Um,
Agreed. There is something to the thrill of it, though, and pulling it off last minute.
yeah.
As a self proclaimed procrastinator, I can procrastinate with the best of them. And there's something I always used to say, I thrive under pressure. Like, I don't know that that was necessarily good for me to put myself in those situations. And I don't always procrastinate, but when I do it well. And yeah, I mean, again, think about the extra stress that you've now put on yourself that's unnecessary. Like, just identifying, not saying that you can fix all of these things in one day or week or month or year, but just becoming cognizant of when you are um, kind of turning back to these behaviors and being aware and saying, okay, is this really serving me? Or does this give me copious amounts of stress and anxiety that I could have done without?
Totally. Yeah. Yeah. Avoidance is another one. Anytime you avoid something, it just creates more anxiety. Like there's a saying that I use with my patients a lot of times, and there's 3 A's to anxiety. Anxiety being the first one is maintained by avoidance, the second one, and
Mm.
then defeated by activity. So this could even go down the whole exposure for PTSD kind of route, right? If
Mhm.
we approach what we are anxious about, the feeling goes away. That's the trick to anxiety. It's my favorite thing probably in the world to work with, just because once you know it's tricks, then you can work out of them. Essentially, it's like
Mhm.
judo, or some other type of martial arts. But it's real important to understand the connection between avoidance and anxiety. And then if you are an overdoer, you know, that's another behavioral pattern that's attached to some of these thoughts that we talk about, but that also creates its own cycle. So we go from the extremes again, from avoidance to overdoing. There
Mhm.
is a healthy balance there. But it's
Yeah.
more like a teeter-totter again, perhaps, not one that just maintains this beautiful line of like an equilibrium. It is much more like a teeter-totter that it's fine for us to be on, but again, to be aware of where we're at within all of these different traps.
I love that. I'm also a stick my head in the sand kind of gal. So, really good at avoiding things that I don't want to deal with. And, but again, getting better over time, not perfect. Hopefully, still have some years to work on these things. But that's a biggie, I think, for a lot of people. Is if I just ignore it, it'll go away. I don't know. It's never actually worked out for me. But again, there's ways you find coping skills
Mhm.
and somehow, some way, things will work out. But if you, at some point, you do have to address it and you have to face it head on. But I am certainly one of those people that's really good at ignoring things too.
Oh, we all have these beautiful tricks and trays that we like
Mhm.
to, kind of dive into at times. It's just being aware that if the water we're swimming in is safe or it's filled with sharks and jellyfish, I would prefer
Right.
not to be in that water if I'm going to take a dip. So
Yeah, I agree.
there you go. I would just say that if this episode or the things that we talked about kind of resonate with you, please check out our resource page. We got a bunch of good um, tips, strategies, little things on there that'll hopefully be helpful. There are tons of books out there. Again, I would check to make sure that they are approved by the American Psychological Association. They should have like a little stamp or a little caveat on there because you don't want to, just you want to make sure what you're reading is quality, I suppose. Might be important. But then on top of that, always, always reach out for help, especially if you find yourself in one of these chronic places or where it is disruptive to you, to your thoughts, to yourself, to your actions, or anything. This is all workable again. And sometimes it just needs like a helping hand in order to get to that kind of point. And there are many of qualified people out there that um, could quickly help to identify these things and work with you on it. So there's always hope with it, is what I would say too.
Yeah, I mean, I think our hope is that people can take the things we talk about and go back and apply them to their lives. I know, like me personally, there's definitely some things that I'm going to apply or keep working on, but ultimately knowing that if you need help with something, it's just like, some people can just go to the gym and work out and achieve the results they want. Some people need to hire that personal trainer. They need that person that's going to um, hold them accountable, or that dietitian, or somebody that's going to help them with their food intake, or, making sure they're getting proper nutrients. Like sometimes you have to implore, I don't know what the right word is for that, but sometimes you do have to reach out for help and get um, the losing my mind, get the experts. There you go. Or get someone that knows how to support you correctly. But hopefully, just thinking about some of these things when you're starting down a negative thought pattern of, okay, and just stopping yourself right then and saying, how is this serving me? I am making this up in my head. I'm believing it to be a fact. Now my heart is racing. Now I'm getting anxious. Now I'm catastrophizing. What could possibly, like, you recognize your rabbit hole as you're diving in, and change those thoughts. I mean, it really sounds so simple. It's so hard, but it's like anything. The first step is just recognizing when you're having it and
Hmm.
going, oh, is this actually, am I like, is this a truth? Is this a fact? Or is this a thought that I have completely pulled out of thin air?
Sure. Yeah. And again, it's so easy to find ourselves there and then to react to it instead of respond to it.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a
Mm-hmm.
big difference between the
Big
two.
difference.
Yeah. Yeah.
Always want to be preventative if you can instead of being reactive.
Right. Or at least
Big
responsive.
thing in life, or at least responsive. I mean, again, just more tools and tricks to help as we kick off Mental Health Awareness Month. Today is
Yeah.
actually May 1st for us as we record this, and it's kicking off the month of mental health awareness, which we clearly feel very passionately about. And that's our hope, is that with each podcast, we're bringing you some sort of content that you can resonate with in your own mental health struggles, or maybe you're not struggling with it, but you might have someone you love that is struggling with mental health. And we always want you to have something to take back to then apply, something that is truly helpful.
Hmm.
So check out our resources page at lylaspodcast.com. You can find us on YouTube. You can find us on Facebook and Instagram. And of course, catch our podcasts anywhere where you catch all your podcasts.
That's exactly right. So, wow,
Uh,
what a wrap, huh?
what a wrap. All right. Episode 19 in the books. Until next week, LYLAS.